French Canadian voyageurs working in this space, as we would say today. It was interesting to me to think about in putting this together, like these original gig workers, right? Like today we think of it, but they were all gig workers who were like being exploited by the industry, and that trade collapsed from over trapping and also just the limits of the market. So then you have the canneries come in, right? And it was pretty profound in terms of how quickly that became the next empire building extractive industry that popped up here. And I think we're all aware of that. So now you have more gig workers, right? So you have the butterfly fleet of people fishing the Columbia River. And of course, I think we all know, if you've lived here any amount of time, we have a lot of Scandinavian immigrants. It's interesting to me because we came here from Alaska, and so I had done some historical writing about Alaska, and at least in that part of the world, Scandinavian immigrants were very much looked down upon.
The Irish.
Like the Irish. And I haven't, here, you would never know that. There's not so much like Scandinavian pride, but, and they did, they were not immigrants who were necessarily exploited here, but they were gig workers. So in that sense, they were in small boats. They were gill netting for the most part. There were, as we'll see here in a minute, there were fish trappers. They used fish traps, but and purse seiners, but gill netting was the primary thing they did. And so you had all these canneries popped up. The cannery owners quickly organized so that they could price fix, right? So they were paid at that time. It started out being fishing was paid per fish, and then it was paid per pound. But 2 cents per pound for what they were doing was very little, and the cannery workers made out like bandits. So Chinese workers, today you can go down to Bornstein and see that they rely on immigrant labor. It's been the same almost all the way throughout Astoria's history, although there was a period that I'll talk about in a minute where, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, that the Chinese were here as a huge part of the labor force. They were exploited, a lot like immigrant labor today. So much doesn't change. And they have this again, I'll just use the word racist, even though it's kind of overused, like the iron chink machine that pushed a lot of those workers out. But really, it was the Exclusion Act that made it, and just the systemic discrimination that seems to be a tradition in our country.
Why would they? What was the act about?
Why did they exclude the Chinese? I think it's to me. Chris probably has more insight, but to me, it's the same as why we see brown people excluded today, right? Like because they looked different, because they had a different culture. There was all this. They're taking our jobs, but there were jobs that nobody wanted to do. It was horrible work. Just like, and again, we see that today, like meat packing plants working out in the fields. Now you get. I went to the grocery store the other day and I said, "Where's the green peppers?" They're like, "Well, you haven't had them for a week." And I'm like, maybe it was a bad idea to deport all those people who were picking them. But so it's very similar. That it was the amount of prejudice against the Chinese during this era was huge, and it was more. Even though there was the Irish, anybody who looked more like the Anglo-Saxons, since our president just made this big speech about our Anglo-Saxon roots, supposedly anybody who looked more like that more easily could be brought into the fold, so to speak, in mainstream. But the Chinese, that Astoria has the underground, a lot of the Chinese were forced into there to live, actually. Not everybody, but the, kind of the Bond Street area also was the, but it was a segregated.
And we had a sundown too, didn't we?
Right.
Yeah,
They had to be.
at
off
curfew.
the streets.
Yes, yeah, a lot of
Outside.
restrictions. And when you look at the rhetoric, it was, I would say, more, I think a little more pronounced than what you see today of people saying like, oh, they smell bad and they do these weird things, they have these weird customs. And I mean, that was a lot of, to answer your question, why they were excluded. And then I just an interesting saying among fishermen and cannery workers from back in the day. The 1890s is when things really came to a head within the fishing part of Astoria's history. So with the Scandinavians, my brother and I were talking about this morning. I mean, they had, especially when you get into the 1890s and more so the early 1900s, you have a pretty big socialist influence coming in with the Scandinavian population. And so we see, like described here, like pretty radical political traditions. They supported the IWW, which was considered, I guess, probably the most radical. It wasn't the concept of the IWW was that we have all these trade unions, which had started earlier, decades before, but all workers need to unite, right? So it was pretty out there and radical, and it was immigrants that really helped grow that movement in this area. So I think we all are familiar with Uniontown, and one of the big canneries in Uniontown was an actual union cannery. So I'll talk about how that came to pass, but there was a Columbia River Fishermen's Protective Union. So if you look at this timeline, it starts with a beneficial aid society to pay death benefits to widows of drowned fishermen. This concept was very common among immigrant communities. And my husband, in addition to being a longtime union member from a union family, also with his people in the Midwest were Hungarian immigrants. And they had Hunky Hall, is what they called it among themselves. But it started, and it's still a building and an organization that kind of exists today, but it started as a beneficial aid society. We call it mutual aid today. When immigrant populations would come in, they'd typically be ostracized. They'd typically be taking work that no one else wanted. In the case of for instance, people from Eastern Europe, they took work in meatpacking plants. Anybody's read like Sinclair Lewis, and you know about like the conditions there that were
Upton Sinclair.
Upton Sinclair, thank you. Upton Sinclair. Yeah, so it was because of those kind of conditions in those industries that were dangerous that they needed to be able to support widows and orphans when people were killed at work. So that's how a lot of these efforts started. That was the Hungarians had that, the fishermen in this area had that, and then they rebranded, although I'm sure they didn't call it that then, as the Columbia River Fishermen's Protective Union. And so in addition to supporting families, they also advocated for higher fish prices. And then you have the beginnings of what will end up being a huge strike in the area. You had over 400, fishermen who signed a pledge refusing to fish for less than river is saying that used to be paid per fish. And then they affiliated with the AFL back in the day and got 2,500 people involved. So it was a pretty big step. And then they had the big strike in 1896, and it was over the price per pound. The fishermen wanted, I talked about it, got as low as 2 cents per pound. They wanted 5 cents. The cannery cannery, they call it the Packers Association. The cannery owners who were already making up big, they were Astoria's wealthy. I mean, we think of the Flavel House, right, with the him doing the river guiding, but the real big wealth in Astoria during this time was with the Packers, and so they couldn't get what they wanted, and they went on strike, and it ended up with the National Guard being sent in actually by the state of Washington. And the reason, so this, when you think about the tumult that comes with labor situations, there's generally, like, you have your scabs who will break the strike lines. But with fishing, it was even a little more complicated because there was these alternate ways of fishing. So the gill netters were all united, but the fish trappers, who were mostly on the Washington side, kept fishing. I mean, it was a bonanza for them, right? Because the fish are just going through, and so they saw an opportunity, and that's where the conflict happened. And it did end in violence. There was violence. That non-union fishermen, which I believe that was a fish trap person as opposed to a gill netter. And you can see it went on, if you look at the dates, for like more than a month. And the unification to me is really striking. I mean, these gill netters were watching all the fish go by. I mean, they're watching their livelihood go by, and they stood together. And they finally, there was a compromise of 4.5 cents per pound, and as soon as they went back to work, it went back down to 2 cents. Yeah. So, what do? Well, first of all, before we get to what they do, this is an interesting, to look at how the hostility toward these anarchist hordes and the people of European peasantry, was very evident when people looked from the outside at what was happening in Astoria. There was local support for the gill netters, but to me, I feel like the caveat is that the whole town was losing money, right? Everybody was losing money because that's where the economy was here. So back to what they did. Once they got screwed again by the Packers, they decided, hey, we can do this too. We're all going to put up a share, $100 per person, and we're going to form our own cannery. And that's what they did. They had 3, at their peak, the Union Fishermen's Cooperative Packing Company had 3 locations in Astoria. I believe 1 was the actual cannery and 2 were buying stations. Where they bought fish, yeah, because you gotta bring them in and you gotta can them. So I believe that's how it was sorted out. And only one of those buildings still stands today, and that is over on the east side of town. But the Cannery Pier Hotel is built on the pilings of one of the original Union Fishermen's Cooperative Packing Company. So it became the largest packers, and was sold late 1940s. So it was an operation. So let's talk about the radicals. I mentioned the Finnish immigrant community that my brother was informing me, like, that all the Scandinavian countries had they're kind of at the forefront of socialist.
Yeah, social democracy, broadly speaking.
Yeah, yeah.
Invented the welfare state, more or less.
Yeah, so they people who immigrated here brought a lot of that thinking. And how many have read Karl Malante's Deep River? No, I recommend it. It's great. It's a novel, but it's based on his Finnish grandmother, who was a labor organizer with the IWW in Astoria. And so he used that rich material from his family and brought in a lot of the history in this area. So there was a lot of organizing that went on, especially in the Finnish community. And I already mentioned how the IWW distinguished itself from the trade union. They were the only union during World War I that opposed the U.S. entering World War I. Because, the U.S. came on late into the war, and so has anybody else heard of the Centralia tragedy in 1919? So this was sort of where the IWW was already, obviously, once you have a war going on and you get this uber patriotism thing happening, so they're the bad guys because they oppose it. They're already the bad guys because they're radical, and they're opposing what the billionaires or billionaires, I guess it would be at that time, control of things, the management control of things. So in 1919, on Armistice Day, there was a parade in Centralia, and the Wobblies, as they were nicknamed, were at the front of the parade, and the American Legion was at the back. And during the parade, the American Legion stormed up to the front, and a whole fracas ensued. A huge fight broke out, and by the time it was over, there were 5 deaths, and one of them was achieved by the Legion members, which the Legion was actually new at that time as well. But they just really saw the IWW as a threat, and so they lynched. The Legionnaires lynched IWW member. They shot someone they thought was an IWW member that was actually on their side, so that was interesting. And then there were 3 other shootings, and they never did. They assumed that it was they were Legionnaires who were killed, so they assumed it was IWW. But obviously, just from what I've told you, it was a confusing situation. It was never really determined who was responsible for this. But even so, there were lots of IWW people that arrested.
Were they associated with that communist?
Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah, because of the socialist influence, because of the more radical,
Also,
ideas.
a lot of anarchists.
Anarchists.
And it was after the Soviet Union.
Yeah, there was a big Red Scare after the Russian Revolution.
Yeah, it all kind of. This was kind of often noted like the Centralia was big as the beginning of the end for the IWW. It was probably the beginning of the end was before that. And then, because when you think about your history, Lenin came to power in 1920, right, Chris? I think.
21, I think.
21. Okay, so
right.
and once that happened, then the Red Scare really took hold. And
it didn't help they killed all of the leaders, in the late 1920s.
Yes.
So people with money get a little scared.
Yeah. That's really interesting. We don't want to leave out women, although women, because women did like a lot of the labor organizing. That's what I mentioned, Carl Merlate's grandmother. And they also did a lot of unpaid labor, obviously. That's not acknowledged. They also, if you've been over to Pier 39 and you've gone through the little museum there, the women, at Bubble Beach and that ended up leaving. And it's all women, right? Like Coffee Girl, it was all women. They replaced the Chinese workers. So you lose you have this exclusion act that made it hard for the Chinese to keep coming here and taking these jobs. So then who's going to do them next? Layer of people who you rely on for jobs somebody wants. So extractive industries, again, we have this, there's kind of a parallel with logging. And by the way, a lot of the IWW organizing was, like I mentioned earlier, in logging camps, which was, as far as I can tell, kind of unsuccessful organizing. They got people to join on, but then they weren't able to topple anything in terms of the way things were done, and due to all the circumstances involving IWW that I just talked about. But basically, you can see from this timeline, I think we all know that the dams, which the Fishermen's Union here was opposed those strongly, and I think they were the only ones to put that out there, opposing that. But eventually, the cooperative folded because the fishing industry collapsed, right? For reasons that extractive industries often collapse. pushed in that direction. So, I mean, these are things that we still have today. There is, like I said, that in Alderbrook, there is one building left standing. Is that the one that was for sale recently, Michael? I think it might be.
Alderman Station.
Yeah, it's in Alderbrook, and it's kind of getting ready. But
Oh, no, it's been restored.
has it been restored? Oh, okay.
It was on our studio for 30 years.
Oh, good. Okay, it's not the one I'm thinking of. Yay.
I got lots of pictures on my phone.
Oh, good. So did you know that used to be the Union Packing Company?
It was the Scandinavian. What do you call this?
Connected with that. So anyway, we do have this huge working class heritage that that we probably don't talk about enough here. I added a couple slides just to transition over to Chris, who's going to talk more broadly about like what happened to the labor movement in our country. I don't know. I think he and I agree. Neither one of us know what we can do about it, but he's going to give us a little broader perspective. I just pulled these from a person on the internet who is smarter than I am about these things. But I thought these, and I don't know that these are really like rules to live by, but I just thought it was food for thought. Like when I think about, if I take this back to 1896, think about the strike in Astoria that we talked about. They had these things. They had a target, right, that they could hurt the Packers. They had demands, a quantitative demand. They had enough people to shut the system down. Yeah, they were the fish trappers, but they were the minority. They couldn't, the Packers had to eventually get the Gilnetters back out there. They had financial and moral support. They had mutual aid so they could keep going. I'm sure it wasn't easy. And they had the will to stick with it. So, so they did accomplish things. And then I think the thing that's not on this list, but that I think is important, is they also they thought creatively about, okay, we could have our own camp, right? So they took it a step farther. Instead of saying no, you have to say no, but then at a certain point you have to say yes. And this also came from the same person, and I think I always just like, in these days it's for me easy to feel hopeless about things. And so I appreciate that there's, there are some thoughts about what we can do. And you guys probably have other ideas as well. But just, supporting unions, backing candidates and laws that, raise wages. Quit rewarding companies that run on poverty pay. Hello, Jeff Bezos, and speaking plainly about, I think this is good, like low wages are coercion. And not dismissing worker anger. I guess there was recently, I read about this and it kind of was off my radar and then came onto my radar that the guy in California that set fire to the warehouse, did you guys hear about that? Like it was just, we gotta do something. And just basically, he filmed himself doing it. It's like, you're not paying a living wage. Like until you pay a living wage, these things are gonna keep happening. It's easy to look at that and say, oh, well, that was crazy. No, it's actually, he's pointing out that people are trapped. So, and then easier said than done, but using and strengthening different ways to push for change. I don't know, I think again, this seems kind of hopeful to me, so it doesn't escalate into something worse later. I think, I don't know, when you look at history, like sometimes it has to escalate something worse before it gets better. But anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Lehmann, who is my brother and also, more importantly for you guys, a journalist. He is the DC correspondent for The Nation magazine. Before that was the editor of the Republic magazine, and just has a really, trying to think of the right word. He's, like I said, very principled, knows his stuff, and I know you're going to
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Actually, yeah, I don't have it. Um, all right, thank you for coming to my presentation. So yes, thanks for coming out today. I am, as my sister said, a long-time journalist. I'm also I think a recovering academic historian. So I've done a lot of that. I'm ABD, which means all the dissertation, but also means all but done in American history. I've studied a lot of the political / labor side of our history. And I first want to issue a disclaimer that I'm actually here on vacation. And my sister said this was going on when I did a talk, and it's my day job to cover national politics, and I haven't had a vacation since Trump was sworn in the second time. I was really looking forward not to thinking about any of this. So I want you to all understand, first of all, this, whatever else you take away from this little exchange, it's not a very organized talk. It is a testament to my love for my sister.
We appreciate your
Yes,
sacrifice.
there's literally no one else I would have done this. So it's funny because I did, to the extent I have remarks prepared, they're about the sort of erasure of organized labor, that sort of activism that Debbie was just describing here in Astoria, from the broader narrative of American history. And this is always a cheesy sort of Toastmaster related talk, but there's always, right, you always leave it a personal anecdote. So I was flying out here from the East Coast at Dulles Airport, and my flight was grounded on the tarmac for an hour and a half. And finally, the captain got on the intercom to say, we're sorry for this delay. We were all set to go, but then we got word from the air traffic control tower that they don't have enough controllers to handle the volume of outgoing flights. And, there are obviously some short-term explanations for this snafu. The DHS shut down, which is in response to the, Gestapo tactics of ICE. Also, the Doge ransacking of the federal workforce, which hit the FAA especially hard. It was actually a fatal crash. And I no longer fly out of National Airport for this reason. It was a fatal crash where a military plane basically flew directly into the path of a commercial airline. But there's a longer term history here, which is in 1981, Ronald Reagan broke the air traffic control regime when they went on strike for, again, better wages, benefits, and working conditions. And it's sort of, this is almost too on the nose, but as I was sitting here thinking of that history, basically, we are all experiencing this breakdown in public infrastructure to deliver a good we paid for, because our federal government declared war on workers and won. And I looked up in the seat opposite to me on the aisle. There was a guy wearing a hat that said faith, family, freedom, and there was some other alliteration.
Ashley?
That would have been more truthful. But, and behind me there was a guy in a MAGA hat. And so I again thought, like, okay, we're sitting here in objective conditions of basically the ransacking and erosion of worker power, and what these white guys around me are worked up about is the preservation of this mythic white American birthright. And it, again, it's a little too on the nose. Right? We're not able to see what the actual problem here is, and we've been encouraged to wander off into these reactionary fantasies about a country that really never existed, but is used as a rhetorical bludgeon to keep everyone separated. I'm thinking, again, like, as you were saying about Chinese immigrants, today, immigrants from our southern border are taking our jobs. They're, as you were saying, they're violent criminals, they're dirty, blah, 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 all of which are objectively lies, which I'll get to in a moment. But so that sort of got me in a better frame of mind of thinking, God, my sister's fucked up my vacation.
But Ronald Reagan did first.
Yes, he was a pioneer. So I just want to briefly, when I say, it sounds a little rhetorically overheated to say the history of the labor movement has been erased in our country, but if you actually go back, and these are just literally examples that occurred to me. So, but you take the civil rights movement, for example, the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. We all know the story. Rosa Parks, this seamstress, tired at the end of the day, refused to give up her seat for a white passenger on the Montgomery bus. Rosa Parks was a long time activist involved in the labor movement. The co-organizers of the Montgomery bus boycott were the National Brotherhood of Pullman Porters, a very important Black labor union. And this is the other piece of the civil rights history, literally organized the March on Washington in 1963, the famous moment where Martin Luther King delivers the I Have a Dream speech that led indirectly to the passages of the Voting Rights Act, which the Supreme Court just destroyed 2 days ago. But the name of the March on Washington, which you never hear, was the March for Jobs and Freedom. And there was a reason jobs was first. Right? A. Philip Randolph had previously, the whole idea of a March on Washington for civil rights was his idea. He debuted it in 1941 as a threat to the Roosevelt administration during the Second World War, saying, look, we're going to shut down wartime industries unless you desegregate. And it worked. Roosevelt agreed, and so there was never a 1941 March on Washington. But again, 22 years later, Philip Randolph does the same thing, and he called up Martin Luther King saying, "Oh, we're doing this. Can we count on your support?" And that's how Martin Luther King got involved. And side note here, another thing we never hear in our history: Martin Luther King was a socialist. He was assassinated in Memphis when he was part of the sanitation workers. And the whole latter half of the civil rights movement is about addressing the needs of Northern African Americans after you were able to get the formal right to the franchise in the South. King understood, this isn't going to do anything unless people have real equality in their working life. So the other big piece of the missing history of labor, and I think people who know me know that I can go on forever about this particular topic, is populism, which is a word in our brain dead mainstream press is just used as cognate with democracy. Donald Trump, these raving nationalists, white supremacists. The actual history of populism is the history of small tenant owners, and originally in the South, but they were also part of the Grange movement, which we talked about earlier. There's an old Grange hall up on the Seaside Highway there. And it was a very direct, again, effort to organize your productive economic lives, because much as the fishermen in Astoria, farmers after the panic of 1891 were in this vice-like grip. You had railroads which controlled the access to the market. You had in the South, especially, basically former slave owner land barons who, would control their access, basically land them in dead peonage. And you could only buy goods from the company store to get you through the next harvest, and you never got out of it. So much like the fishermen in the the populace decided, we're going to take control of our working lives. And, we are the people who actually produce the wealth. These other people are just exploiting us. So they actually devised, and it was a centerpiece of the 1896 campaign, this year of the strike, what they called the sub-treasury system, which was basically a vast national model of an agricultural cooperative where farmers would deposit crops and they would get, actual credit on terms they could live on. And it would be the foundation actually for our currency in the country. It was a very completely thought out model of how you could actually reward labor in our country. And the sad historical footnote to that is the sub-treasury system, as it was called, actually became the model for the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve operates on the same regional idea. They organize credit, but all for the sake of owners and bosses and bankers, not for work. So it drives me up a wall when I hear Donald Trump described as a quote populist or any of these characters, because the actual political economy of populism has nothing to do with any of it. And speaking of civil rights, Southern white populists tried to organize black farmers, and that was a mortal threat to the old slaveocracy in the South. So they were brutally, again, much as the case, they were subjects of clan raids, racial terror. So that's just all by way of, a very thumbnail history lesson from my airplanes. But the larger point here is these erasures have a cumulative effect, and we now live in a public discourse where labor is all but invisible. And the obvious example to take is the MAGA war on immigration. There's, immigrants are always caricatured as, people who are gaming public benefit systems, who are violent criminals, or, dirty and in some fundamental way, deeply unproductive, parasites on our polity. And every item in that litany, as I said, is a lie. And it's, the big lie is, you heard Donald Trump say it over and over again on the campaign trail that they're bleeding Social Security and they're bleeding Medicare. What is actually the case for undocumented workers is they are paying taxes to sustain those systems, and they're drawing no benefits. So, what that translates to over time, this is the Congressional Budget Office figure. From 1994 to 2023, immigrant workers created a $14.5 trillion surplus. Because again, they're paying all these taxes, they're taking out nothing benefits. In the coming decade, between the years 2024 and 2034, immigrant workers will contribute about $8.9 trillion to the GDP of the country. So anytime I'm in this situation, which happens distressingly often because I'm in Washington and I get put on these, toy soldier, stupid pundit debates from debating someone from the right who's going to say something like, there's an immigrant invasion. And I always say, like, so tell me, what kind of invader gives you $9 trillion? Because if that's the case, they're not very good at it, and you probably shouldn't be worth it. This is all part of, the same thing that, that was describing in 1896. There is this xenophobic slash, discourse that exists to attack workers. And, in all of these, dumb recursive debates we have about immigration in this moment, you never hear these things. You never hear, immigrants are actually a net economic, an enormous asset. It's, by the way, also one of the reasons we did, unlike other Western countries, did not have a prolonged recession coming out of COVID. Is the immigrant workforce picked up the slack, and it's in part because they work under conditions of no power, and they don't really have that bargaining latitude. But it's true. So there is just fundamental failure to think. We obviously live in this time of oligarchy, where all the sort of role models for our politics and economy are the real parasites, like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. In 1980, they really needed, because he, again, was an piece of the oligarchs, needed at least the appearance of working class support. And you see what happens, right? this devil's bargain. I would dearly love for Sean Duffy to study that history a little more closely. And in the wake of the PACRA debacle, Reagan basically dismantled the National Labor Relations Board, and the Supreme Court went to work over time, dismantling fundamental rights to organize a workplace without retaliation, to collective bargaining in workplaces of a certain size. And we've lately seen, again, in the Roberts Court, this pattern go into dystopian overdrive, where we not only have a court that does not recognize basic labor rights. Legal scholars now say that workers' rights have entered a quote constitutional black hole. But also they don't recognize fundamental precepts of small d democratic political economy like antitrust. That is, the Biden administration briefly tried to rely on antitrust enforcement, and that's over. And meanwhile, you also have these insane decisions like 2010 Citizens United, which enshrines the absolute free speech rights, in air quotes, of corporations, and Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, which gives corporations actual personhood under the law. And in terms of the Supreme Court piece of it, we, again, are now seeing how utterly rogue and influential the Supreme Court is in our politics. I think it is important to review the history of Supreme Court rulings in the specific sphere of labor rights. Because I think there's long been a myth since the Warren Court that the court is either an impartial arbiter of interests, strictly reading the Constitution or is actually supporting broad democratic aims, including in the workplace. And that is nothing in the history of the Supreme Court supports that, except one aberration I'll get to. But so in 1905, the court issued a decision in Lochner versus New York, which was basically an effort on the part of the New York legislature to control wages and hours in bakeries. And the court took this very hardline position that you can never violate the sacrosanct language of contracts. And every contract is basically an exercise in impunity by bosses. Workers cannot, form. At this point, they didn't have a right to collective bargaining. They couldn't form unions of their own to counter bargaining and reach their own contracts. And even elementary things like wages and hours and workplace safety that mentioned, the Upton Sinclair novel, The Jungle, about the meatpacking industry. That was all now under Lochner just against the law. And it continued that way until 1933, when the still reactionary Supreme Court, in a decision called ALA Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the United States, basically declared the National Recovery Administration, which was FDR's sort of big economic centerpiece of the New Deal, which was going to intervene again on the part of workers and consumers in the economy. They declared it simply illegal. You cannot alter the fundamental strictures of the free market in this make-believe version of the American economy. And that was the moment, and this is another moment in labor relations, where FDR said, okay, I'm going to expand the court. I'm also going to establish tenure and age limits for justices, which freaked everyone out. There was it's now referred to, in the history books. My brother-in-law actually wrote one of these books as the court packing crisis. But what it really is a labor rights crisis, right? And again, this is the piece of it that somehow just always falls out of the historical narrative. And the other important thing to note about the court packing crisis was it works. These older, mostly Southern and all elite educated, I think there's a figure that 98% of Supreme Court justices until the 30s came from Ivy League backgrounds, and it's the same today. If we could only blow up Yale Law School, the country would be much better shape. I figure my sister is promoting arson, basically. So, these elite judges decided, the president's gunning for us, and he has popular opinion on his side. So we better backtrack. And so they issued a decision basically recognizing, it's called NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel, that basically confirmed you can't, retaliate against workers trying to work in this workplace by firing them, upheld the basic framework of the National Labor Relations Board. And this was the takeoff moment for the modern union. Between 1933 and 1938, the number of unionized workers in America skyrocketed from 2.7 million to more than 8 million. And that is also how workers became a key partner in the New Deal coalition. It was said of the Roosevelt administration, from the second term on, that anytime there was any sort of legislative proposal or policy decision before FDR, they would say, well, what would Sidney think? And that referred to Sidney Hillman, who was then the president of the American Federation of Labor. I'm sorry, the CIO, the other half, the Congress of Industrial Organization. So again, I think this history is really useful to revisit because of the world we're now in, right? We are a political universe away from a situation where a labor leader can be considered basically someone who has veto power over what the president's going to do. And I think another big piece of this is for the past 40 plus years, the Democratic Party has treated this coalition that FDR created as a captive constituency. They passed GATT and NAFTA in the 90s, which actually did, as Ross Perot predicted at the time, create a giant second hand of the manufacturing sector. The town Deborah and I grew up in was a central casualty of that. It used to be the farm implement manufacturing capital of the world. It is now the riverboat gambling capital of the upper Midwest. And the logic the Democrats of the sort of third wave Clinton vintage would always say, when there would be pushback from unions and workers about globalization and offshoring is, well, what are workers going to do? Vote Republican? And we now see that the answer is yes, right? Davenport, where we grew up, I remember in 2016, because the Iowa caucus is the first event in the presidential cycle, the first wave of stories about the white working class embracing Trump were all in Davenport. And it spread from there. So, this is the political environment we're now in. And as long as Democrats continue applying this sort of management appeasing agenda, and the Republican MAGA movement can sort of posture in this cost-free manner by demonizing immigrants, by claiming, they represent the real America. They posture as the champion of workers' rights in a setting where they're, again, actively destroying and enriching the enemy of workers. It's really an Alice in Wonderland that we're living through right now. And it's, again, I say this with the reading interest of someone with a background in history, it's because we just don't understand this history the way it actually unfolded. We have this sort of, I guess, what would be the word, Whiggish narrative that, everything proceeds along this steady arc of progress, and, all of our institutions from the presidency and the Congress and the courts are gradually making things better. They're creating conditions of social peace. Yes, there will be conflicts, but moderation will prevail. And the entire modern history of the American labor movement and American politics demonstrates that's a lie, and that's why you don't hear about it.
The winners write the narrative.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And the people who platform the narrative in the industry that I'm in are very much to blame. We're now seeing who owns journalism now are Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and David Ellison, and anyone who is, and that was something I also meant to mention. I'm old, so when I was growing up, every major metropolitan paper in the country had at least one labor report, because that was the economy. Like you couldn't publish a paper in Detroit or in Seattle or any of these places without covering the labor movement. It's a critical part of the local economy. Now, of course, local newspapers themselves are dying, but labor reporters died out in the 90s. because all these conditions were already kind of in the wake of the Reagan Revolution, reshaping our communications industry. But I'm like my sister, I'm going to try not to be entirely despairing because I think, it is true that we face these really serious obstacles to workers reclaiming serious power, but the obstacles aren't really that greater than they were in the Lochner era or before the Schlechter decision outlawing the NRA. Now, as then, the key to breaking the deadlock that bosses and bankers hold over our politics is to secure power in the workplace, and to build out from that base into the broader political economy. Now, as then, we need to fundamentally recast these reactionary narratives about a mythic American identity, like the guys in the hats on my planet, and the fanciful, sacred freedom of contracts and corporate self-expression, into a vindication of real worker solidarity across these divisions created by oligarchs and bosses to divide us. Now, as then, the state and the courts won't be moved to cultivate and expand workers' power under anything other than concerted mass political pressure, the very same kind of pressure that FDR brought to the Supreme Court. When people say the courts are about politics, like point to the court packing episode, they know. And now, as then the most important pencil for the workers' movement is to more organize.